VK7 Whiskey Whiskey on behalf of the Northern Tasmanian Amateur Radio Club, and I'll be using the club call sign VK7 Tango Alpha Zulu. Right, over the next 30 minutes we'll be practicing our CW. In San Francisco it's 1 o'clock in the morning. In New York it's 4 o'clock in the morning. In London it's 9 o'clock, and in Paris 10 o'clock. Singapore and Hong Kong 4 p.m. in the afternoon. Here locally it's 7 p.m. in the evening. That's the same for Sydney, Australia as well. But we're in Tasmania, so we'll be continuing with the letters that you learned last week. And the letters were Oscar Papa, Quebec, Romeo, Mike. And of course we'll be introducing new letters for you to learn for next week. Now, don't forget, during the day, if you see a sign or a number plate with a character you recognize, you can practice by just saying it quietly to yourself. Perhaps you're a reader and you're just scanning the text in a book. You can recognize characters by saying them quietly to yourself with dits and das. But tonight, first, we're going to begin with the manual Morse sheet, like the previous weeks. Now, this will only be for a few minutes, as I've prepared a separate file for those who want to continue using the manual Morse sheet called Week 4. And then we'll go on and we'll practice the letters Oscar Papa, Quebec, Romeo, Mike, OPQRM, using the Farnsworth spacing, where the characters will be sent at about 8 or 9 words per minute, but with large gaps between them. Then as you progress, the gaps become shorter. Now, have a paper and pencil ready to write down what you receive. I guess if you write with your right hand, you're going to put your finger, your left index finger or your other finger, on the start position on the manual Morse code sheet. And you've already done it before. Let's see how we go. So, switching to CW, this is VK7 Tango Alpha Zulu. Please stand by, ready with your manual Morse sheet. Here we go, CW. Okay, back with you on voice. This is Nick, VK7 Whiskey Whiskey with the call sign, the club call sign, VK7 Tango Alpha Zulu for the Northern Tasmanian Amateur Radio Club. So, what did I send? What on earth did I send? Has this guy gone wacky? Moose cods are tops. That's Mike, Oscar, Oscar, Sierra, Echo, Charlie, Oscar, Delta, Sierra, Romeo, Tango, Oscar, Papa, Sierra. Moose cods are tops. Why do I do that? Because some people will automatically try and guess what I'm sending. And they may have thought, oh, he's going to send Morse codes. Morse codes. So I thought, no, I'm going to put different words in. So that's why we do it. It stops you from journalizing. Right. That's all we're going to do on the manual Morse code sheet today. As I said, there's a separate file called manual Morse sheet called week 4, which is available for you. Now, when you are calling CQ, you'll often hear stations sending da-di-da-di, da-da-di-da. So this is information of the sorts of things that you're going to hear on a regular basis. You're going to hear CQ, a general call, I seek you. And then you're also going to hear Bravo Kilo for break or back to you, back, Bravo Kilo. And you may hear stations saying Golf Mike, Golf Delta, Golf Echo, Golf November. What does that mean? It means good morning, good day, good evening, good night. These are common things that you will hear when you are listening around. And then, of course, 73s. Now, we know we haven't dealt with numbers yet, but 73s is an abbreviation for best wishes. And 88s is love and kisses as well. You don't hear that many on air. But if you hear a couple who are intimately connected, you'll often hear them sending 88s. Or if you're very familiar with somebody. But 73s, da, da, dit, 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 da, da, you'll hear very frequently because people send that at the end of a contact. And you'll also hear the abbreviations like Tango Uniform, thank you. There's also a couple of abbreviations for thanks as well. Tango November X-ray and Tango Kilo X-ray, thanks and thanks. One of the most common things you will hear instead of people using punctuation, full stops or commas, is da, di, 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 da. Da, di, 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 da. And we call that the context separator. It's actually the equal sign that's sent in Morse code. Da, di, 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 da. And instead of, say, using punctuation, they send the context separator. What's the context separator? Well, you might be talking about your antenna, and now you're going to talk about the weather. So you use the context separator. Or maybe you're going to talk about your rig, or the antenna, whatever. Now, I must tell you the protocol for calling another station when you're all on your own, you can't hear anybody else, but you want to call CQ. Now, CQ, da-di-da-di-da-da-di-da. That is usually sent 3 times. Da-di-da-di-da-da-di-da. Da-di-da-di-da-da-di-da, da-di-da-di-da-da-di-da. And then your call sign should be sent 3 times. And at the end of that, you could just send the letter K. We'll get into other pro signs, which mean end of transmission, but a lot of people don't bother with that. They just send out 3 CQs and their call sign 3 times and the letter K or kilo for over. So there's some information for you to do with the protocols of how to have a contact. And we'll be doing more on this later. Now, the 5-letter character groups, which you learned last week, Oscar, Papa, Quebec, Romeo, Mike. Now, I'm going to go through those. I'm going to, first of all, just to refresh you, send each one once, then each one 3 times, and then I'm going to send 8 groups of 5 characters using those letters, but all jumbled up in a different order, and see how you manage to copy what's going on. All right, switching to CW. Please stand by. This is VK7 Tango Alpha Zulu. Okay, that was a little refresher. Now we're going to move into the 5 character in each group. Well, I'm going to send 8 groups using those letters. Oscar, Papa, Quebec, Romeo, Mike. Here we go. characters were coming up the same speed, but the gaps were getting shorter between them, especially for the last two groups of characters. This is what I sent. The first one was Oscar Papa Romeo Mike Mike. The second one was Quebec Romeo Papa Oscar Mike. The third group was Papa Oscar Quebec Mike Oscar. The fourth group, Romeo Oscar Oscar Mike Romeo. Quebec Romeo Mike Oscar Mike. And the last three groups were Quebec Romeo Papa Papa Oscar and Oscar Mike Oscar Romeo Quebec, followed by the last group Romeo Oscar Quebec Romeo Mike. And in actual fact, you may have even recognized words or things that are familiar to you. OP is an abbreviation for operator. QRP, Quebec Romeo Papa, is the Q code for low power. And POQ stands for something else. And rumor, the English word room. And then we have QRM, or QR mum, but QRM, of course, is interference. Now, that is man-made interference as opposed to Quebec Romeo November. So this was Quebec Romeo Mike. Then we had in the next group QRP again and Papa Oscar, power output. And then the last two groups, we had OMO, a well-known washing powder, and in the final group, RQ is Regimental Quartermaster, but we don't use that in CW. In fact, I don't think I've ever heard that in CW. But in the last group, the last three letters were QRM, Quebec Romeo Mike. Again, man-made interference as opposed to the gods of the ether that create lightning and static and rain and all sorts of havoc. So, that was with tonight's letters. Incidentally, when I did send the first lot of letters, Oscar Papa Quebec Romeo Mike, I did send one of those letters twice. Did you manage to copy that? Anyway, now what we're going to do is we're going to send a whole lot more of groups. In fact, 8 more character groups, but this time we're incorporating Alpha X-Ray Sierra Echo Tango and Hotel Bravo Delta India Juliet. So with the last 2 weeks' letters, so let's see how you go with this. This is VK7 Tango Alpha Zulu on behalf of the Northern Tasmanian Amateur Radio Club with the slow Morse course. Please stand by, switching to CW. Okay, back with you on voice. This is Nick VK7 Whiskey with the slow Morse course on behalf of the Northern Tasmanian Amateur Radio Club with the club call sign of VK7 Tango Alpha Zulu Victor Kilo 7 TAZ. Now, what I sent was as follows. The following groups. Well, there may be a couple of words in there or abbreviations that you recognise. The first one is Bravo, Romeo, Oscar, Oscar Mike, Broom. The next one was saxes, as in a pile of saxophones. Sierra, Alpha, X-ray, Echo, Sierra. The third group, Quebec, Romeo, Papa, Tango, X-ray, QRPTX. The next one was Oscar Sierra Charlie, Romeo X-ray, oscillator receiver. AMPPO, Alpha Mike, Papa, Papa, Oscar. AMP is, of course, amplifier, and PO, power output. The next group, Juliet Oscar Bravo, Sierra India, job SI. The final two groups, Hotel India Delta, Echo Sierra, Hides. And the final one, QRX OM, Quebec Romeo X-ray Oscar Mike. You might send that in CW. QRX means wait, stand by, OM, old man. That's not to be derogatory by saying somebody's old. It's just if you don't know their name yet and you suddenly get a phone call or somebody's at the door and you've got to say, hang on a minute, I've got to go and attend to this, mate. Well, just say QRXOM. And then, of course, to your embarrassment, you'll find that you're actually chatting with a YL, a young lady. Now, QRP. Low power. QRP stands for low power. And I would encourage you to look on Jordan's YouTube list. That's VK3 Alpha Charlie Uniform, Victor Kilo 3 Alpha Charlie Uniform, Jordan on YouTube. He has got some great QRP videos, and in fact there's one that is almost going viral because we had a contact where he built up a one transistor transmitter literally soldered together and hanging off his CW key, and we had a QSO probably about 600 kilometers, and this was on 80 meters. Right. So, from the mainland of Australia across to the island of Tasmania, where I'm located. So, next week's letters are Zulu, Charlie, Golf, November, Victor. Zulu, Charlie, Golf, November, Victor. And this is what they sound like. And I'll go through them once, and then each one 3 times. Please stand by. Okay, now those are the letters that you need to learn for next week. Zulu, Charlie, Golf, November, Victor. Okay, so what do you need to know when you're having a contact with somebody? Well, you need to know their call sign. You need to give them a report in terms of signal strength, readability, strength and tone. Remember, readability goes up to 5, strength goes up to 9, and tone goes up to 9. And I'm in the middle of building a very special QRP rig that runs about 5 or 6 watts with one valve, one tube, crystal controlled for 40 meters, and I hope it's going to have a chirp. So that'll be very interesting to see. Call sign, readability, strength, tone, the name and their QTH, their location. That's basically all you need for a minimal contact. Don't forget, resources to help you learn are the ARRL, the RSGB, that's the American Radio Relay League, the Radio Society of Great Britain, lots of things online on the internet, the Wireless Institute of Australia, VK2 Whiskey India, on 3.699 with their 24-hour Morse beacon for learning, that starts at about 5 words per minute, and of course goes up to considerably faster. Oh, there was one thing I wanted to mention to you. On Jordan's YouTube, on VK3 Alpha Charlie uniform, he came across a couple of very worthwhile learning editions for CW. One is called Battleships, and the other one is called Morse Invaders, like Space Invaders. And Battleships, great learning resources. Now don't forget, 40 meters on Tuesday nights, there's the QRS, the Slow Morse evening, run by Mark, VK2 Kilo India. CQQRS. And it doesn't matter where you are in the world, because people have been picking up the slow Morse and joining in from all over the world on 40 meters. Conditions have been really, really good. Now next week, I'm going to talk about how to end a QSO, how to end a contact, and I'm also going to be talking about the use of pro signs. This is where we join 2 letters together without leaving a gap between them, and it signifies, well, let me give you an example. Alpha and Romeo, Didar and Didardit, A and R. But when conjoined, it doesn't sound like Didar, Didardit. It sounds like Didar, Didardit. And that means end of transmission. End of that over. And then people will send the letter K. Oh, well, some people say you shouldn't send the letter K if you've already said that's the end of that transmission. But that's open to debate. Don't forget, next week, how to end a QSO and pro signs, and please learn those characters. Zulu Charlie Golf November Victor. This is VK7 Whiskey with the Slow Morse course on behalf of the Northern Tasmanian Amateur Radio Club, now going clear of this frequency down to 3.567